Boom.
Hey, this is Buddy Levy, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
This is awesome. I've been waiting for a long, long time to have this. You gave me you're so great. You gave me an advanced copy of your book. Here's the link for everybody. Just take a look at this right here. If you want to get a great book, Empire of Ice and Stone is awesome. It's just in time for Christmas. You guys, let me just tell you right now, the story here is bananas. You're not going to believe it. It's an instant movie. As soon as you read it, you can be like, how in the world did these people survive? Right? It's just such a crazy thing. How did you come across the story?
Well, hey, thanks, Pete, for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, the short version is that when I was writing Labyrinth of Ice, I actually came across this story. And to get to the first Arctic book that I did, and I'm actually in the throes of a trilogy now, which is great. This is Empire of Ice and Stone is the second one. I was traveling in Greenland in 2003, and I met this Norwegian woman who was an adventurer, and she told me about Fridtjof Nansen, the great Norwegian explorer. And that, coupled with having grown up with a father who was he was a Nordic ski racer who competed in the Olympics in 1956, and he also traveled in Scandinavia in the 50s. And he was always telling me these stories about how tough the Scandinavians were. So I got really interested in Arctic exploration. And when I was doing the research for Labyrinth of Ice, which came out in 2019, I bumped into this story, and I just had the good sense to file it away somewhere, like I got to come back to this. And then when I finally tidied up Labyrinth of Ice, I opened the files and started reading, and I couldn't believe how amazing this story. I mean, it had everything that you want in an adventure tale.
Yeah, it does, and I want to get into it, but I have to cover this cat that they had. So there's this whole odyssey, and it's crazy, and we're going to talk about all that stuff. But along the way, and we're talking over 1,000 miles of journey and struggle, and people dying, and they got this kitty cat, and this is not like a full on cat. This is a 1 year old cat, right? If I remember correctly.
Right. There's a lot of as the expedition members are assembled on this ship, the Karluk, in and about to depart. There was a lot of lore in those days, and mariners liked having a ship's cat on board, not only because they would eat rodents, which could chew ropes and line and get into food and everything, but they also had a lot of superstition about ship's cats being good luck. And oddly, black cats were known to be better luck. That sort of mythology has changed. Oh, there's Niger Rock. And so,
Yes.
one of the members, it's funny because the expedition leader, Vilhjalmur Stefansson, they asked him if they can get a cat, and he says, no, the cat will get eaten by the sled dogs, because they have like 36 sled dogs on board. And one of the members, he sneaks off onto the dock, and he snags this kitten and tucks it away in the steward's quarters and stuff. And then this cat ends up having an amazing odyssey. And I keep coming back to the cat because the cat may in fact bring them some good luck in the end.
Yeah, it's because you do constantly go back to the cat because there's a little kid
A
on this
couple, yeah.
adventure, right? And so you have all these different things where you're like, man, you're trying to survive, and you got to bring like the dogs you get because the dogs work and everything, but just kitty cat, like, hey, we have to make special accommodations for this thing, and it's just it's crazy. And who thinks about a cat surviving on a sheet of ice? It's
Yeah,
just
no kidding. I mean, it's really remarkable because they once they're we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but it's okay.
yeah.
Once there are members that are having to move across the broken, ruptured ice floes, they tuck this little kitten into a specially made bag that is lined with furs, and it has a drawstring top so that they can feed it through there, and it gets strapped to a sled, and it's just jostling along for 150 miles. It's like, what? It's really great. And
Yeah.
also I think the cat provides some in these harsh environments. Like you mentioned, there's two Inupiat children, Helen, who's 11, and Mugpi, who's 3. And having some domestic normalcy in these situations is actually kind of a tonic. It
Right.
makes people calm to be able to pet a little kitten, because as you say, the sled dogs are kind of gnarly, snarling workhounds, and they're not exactly pets, but this little cat goes on one hell of an adventure.
And I suppose the other thing to say is if this adventure happens, it's going to be a very, very long time, and you're living like on the ship or on the side of the shore or wherever they end up being. And so having the cat there is great. One of the a guy we both know, Andreas Rencendez, wrote about a ship that purposely sails east to west across the Pacific, which had never been done on purpose in recorded history. And the rats, they had a special 24-hour guard because the rats were starving like they were, and the rats were trying to chew their way through the water barrels, right? And so
Yeah.
that's like having a cat out there reaping and taking out rats is a helpful thing. So when you look at like the planning part, like of course they had a cat, right? You need to have a cat on a ship.
Yeah, but it is funny. I mean, you brought up planning, and I have to say that this is one of those
Yes.
expeditions that I'm struck by uh, how foobar this thing goes so quickly, right? So the expedition leader, Vilhjalmur Stefansson, has put together this thing in between late 1912 and early 1913, and probably in a matter of like less than 6 months. He's just in this whirlwind of activity, and as a result of this, he purchases 3 ships, and he's got all this contingent of scientists, and they're going to be embarking on this grand scientific expedition. But he wasn't the most organized, and
Mm.
everything came together pretty fast. So as it turns out, things go awry really fast, and I was struck by that. How quickly nature and things that are out of your control can just conspire against you.
Yeah, I want to ask you about this because this is one of the things I was wondering, because there's a lot of blame to lay and the leader, and he demands to be the leader, right? He's taking certain rights in terms of writing and publishing and all these other things. And he's so comfortable in the Arctic, right? He believes that you can survive out there indefinitely. If he had a good operations officer who's like, "Hey, slow down, we have to do this," would they've got iced in ahead of time and maybe save themselves at the cost of the expedition? And then if it was a regular, whatever regular is up in the Arctic, if it had been a regular season and winter had held off for a few weeks, would they have
Mhm.
also possibly been okay? Like, was this actually bad preparation, or is this action? It's like, hey, let's just act, and I know we'll figure it out, or is this recklessness? Maybe it's both.
Well, you brought up a couple of really good questions, and they're complicated. I mean, I think Stephenson is um, he has a combination uh, of bad luck and poor planning, because
Mm.
just to set the stage a little bit. So Stephenson has put together this 3 ship armada that is going to convene around Point Barrow, Alaska, and then they're going to sail east to this island called Herschel Island above the Canadian Yukon. And the plan is to have these ships all rendezvous there, at which point they can get all this gear together in the proper places, and the scientists on the right, because there are 2 teams, a northern and a southern party. Well, Stevenson ends up sending everybody off at the same time, but the wrong members of the ships are on the wrong members are on the wrong ships,
Right.
and also much of the gear is on these different ships. And so there becomes this refrain where some of the members who record their diaries, Stephenson kept saying, "We'll sort it all out at Herschel Island." Well, as it turns out, the ships get blown apart in a big storm in August of 1913, and they never make it to Herschel Island to sort anything out. But I think you're right in the sense that about having an operations officer. I mean, it was an unusual expedition in that, let's say, there's usually like a supreme commander, and even if it's not a military expedition, there's one person who's in charge, and so in this case, we've got the expedition leader, who's Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a scientist, not a mariner per se. And then he hires to captain the Karluk, which is the flagship, this really reputable master mariner named Robert Bartlett from Newfoundland. Brigus, and Bartlett comes highly recommended by Robert Peary. He actually went with Robert Peary to the North Pole, and Bartlett is this celebrated ice navigator, right? And so on the ship, it's sort of like you'd think that Bartlett's word is the law, but because Stefansson is the expedition leader who has hired Bartlett, you have kind of a dual presence at leadership at the top, at least at the beginning. Now, the way things work out, they're not together for very long, as it turns out.
Yeah. It's one thing to be audacious and put this thing together, kind of going back to this earlier conversation that we're having right now. But it's another thing to go, man, you know what? When people go north, they die a lot of the time. Maybe there needs to be a little more caution. Is he just too bold for his own good? What do you think is his character flaw that really undermines this mission?
Wow, Pete, I've thought a lot about this question because I'm hearing from people. This book is getting quite widely read. I'm really excited about that, and I'm hearing from readers and stuff. And I keep fully expecting that someone to be come in and say, hey, you're kind of hard on Stefansson, because
Right.
I essentially say it's a story about heroism in the form of Robert Bartlett and villainy in the form of Vilhjalmur Stefansson, and it's more complicated than that. I will say what Stefansson ended up writing a couple of major books. One is called My Life with the Eskimo, which he was ironically working on, and this is part of the problem that I lay on him. So when he was traveling to go meet up with the Karluk, he had been previously for 4 years living among native peoples in islands above northern Canada. And he was really good at moving along the ice with small groups in the Inupiat way, and living, by harvesting seals and caribou, but putting together a massive, 30-member, 3 dozen sled dog expedition with multiple ships is a different kind of enterprise. And so Stefansson was penning this book, My Life with the Eskimo, while he was on the ship heading to meet the Karluk. And he took a separate ship, this SS Victoria, a really nice, like, cruise liner, and he's dictating to a secretary of the Museum of Natural History. And I always found it kind of like, wait a minute, shouldn't you be doing preparations for the expedition you're about to embark on, who's with members whose lives are in your care? And instead, he was planning to have this book come out so that he would have this publishing bonanza, and because there was a lot of money to be made in publishing about these expeditions and in speaking tours after the fact, right? So yeah, he was distracted. But I would say that he had a kind of self-centeredness to him that might have been one of his character flaws. This ego that needed to be fueled. Before they even got to this expedition, he had traveled to Europe and obtained publishing and film rights with the New York Times, with the Globe and Mail of Toronto, with papers and cinematic companies in Europe. And you mentioned earlier, so he basically says, I'm not going to draw a salary on this journey, but I get all the publishing rights, and nobody can write about it within a year after it, right? So he was thinking about the lucrative nature of this gig.
Yeah. At some point he abandons his family as well. And so, like, this all goes to this character, but also, is that fair? Like, does this guy, in that time, in that place, is it uncommon to abandon your family? Is this go to his ill preparedness? What do you, again, you get to know the man more than anybody else, but.
Well, yeah. And it's interesting because, so one of the things that happens is, and I don't mind like minor spoilers. I do want people to enjoy there's an incredible amount of drama here, but there are certain things that I'm completely happy to talk about. And one of them is that, if you look at the cover of the book, the Karluk is in dire straits, right? it's been encased in ice off the coast of Alaska, and has been it's sort of been trapped in a mile and a half square of ice, right?
Mm.
And Stefansson is really antsy. This occurs like, I don't know, weeks after they set out. Yeah, 6 weeks after they originally set out from British Columbia, but just like days after they leave northern Alaska, right? And so Stefansson is the two other ships, the Mary Sachs and the Alaska. After they depart, they never see these ships again, right? It's like you know, they get blown away in a storm, and fog and sleet come in, and all of a sudden, everything's just a mess. But Stefansson is on this ship, the Karluk, and he's they're locked in ice and drifting from like for 6 weeks. And meanwhile, Stefan is getting pretty cabin feverish, and he seems to want to be anywhere but on this ship.
Mm.
And first of all, he's not getting any science done really, and he also realizes that the other ships, if they survive, yeah, that's great. You put that up, so it's it has been banked up. They're trying to keep the ice from crushing the hull, and so they've used, I mean, manual labor to cut blocks and shore this thing up so that hopefully when big ice flows encroach on this ice floe they're trapped in, it won't shatter and destroy the ship. But when they're in that sort of state, Stefansson makes this really dubious decision. And he tells Bartlett that he's going to go caribou hunting, and he's going to take three of the best scientists who, in fairness, needed to be not on the Karluk. So I get that. But they're about 10 miles offshore of northern Alaska. And he says, I'm going to go across with 12 of the best sled dogs, these two Inuit hunters that he had hired in Alaska en route, and a number of the scientists, and they're going to bolt for land across the sea ice, right? And the Captain Bartlett is wondering, should the expedition leader, and he wrote a journal and a diary, so you have his thoughts on this. He wrote like, should the expedition leader be leaving his ship in under this guise of caribou hunting, which it turns out that Stefansson may well have known that there weren't very many caribou in that area anyway, and he does this under the pretense of needing fresh meat. Well, they had a bunch of seal already packed in, and a couple of polar bears, so they were okay on that. But what I discovered in my research is that he had this Inuit wife named Fanny and a son with her, a 3-year-old son named Alex, and so I surmise that they were not very far. They were like pretty close to where the ship was drifting at the time.
Mm.
And so he ends up leaving the ship. Here's where bad luck hits him. The very day after he leaves the ship, this massive storm blows in, and it starts moving the Karluk at between 30 and 60 miles a day out into the Arctic, in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, towards Siberia. And meanwhile, Stefansson and this small squad he's got are stranded on this little island, Jones Island, off the northern coast of Alaska. They're stuck there for like a week. And when the fog lifts, I always love this scene, when the fog lifts, Stefansson is just staring out there like, dude, where's my ship? Like, it's gone. And it is gone. And so he even builds a driftwood observation tower, and 15 feet tall, and stands up there peering through binoculars to confirm that the ship is gone. So
Yeah.
he waits until the ice, he's stranded on that island because there's open water between him and land. And so he has to wait until it freezes up again, and then they're able to cross the ice. And meanwhile, so I end up leaving Stefansson, and he's going off to go see his secret family. And then I go with Bartlett and the members of the Karluk, and cut back and forth between what Stefansson's doing or not doing, and what Bartlett. My main concern then, and for the reader, is the experiences aboard the ship, and then afterwards, invariably, when things go really wrong and the ship gets crushed.
Yeah, and I don't want to give any spoilers out either. This is I was trying to talk about the nature of the person, because there's an incredibly resolute and survival. Like, this is a person who does things, and you're like, you're just impressed. Like, if he hadn't have led this expedition, and he continued to do his small scale things, we probably wouldn't know who he was because we don't remember these kind of people. But when you read about him, you're like, oh my gosh, this is an incredible dude who's doing impossible things. Wow. But then you have you know, it's like when you're so good at living on the edge, you think that there's no edge, and you just can continue to do things almost recklessly.
Yeah, and I have to say, I do give Stefansson credit for his scientific work and his doggedness. He ends up retrofitting. He discovers the other two ships have survived, and
Right.
there are still members, and he is able to cobble together these the northern and the southern parties, and so there's another leader of the southern party. But then, what I think where Stefansson sort of fails is that he doesn't do very much to try to find out the fate of the Karluk,
Yeah.
and as opposed to what the Herculean efforts that Captain Bob Bartlett goes to save the members of the Karluk, which is, so to me, that's one of those inexcusable decisions that colors every aspect of him. I
Right.
actually did a podcast a couple of weeks ago with Stephen Ranella, the Meat Eater, and he's a huge Stefansson fan. He was grilling me about how, like, he, even though Stefansson bailed on the Karluk, uh, his ability, like you say, his ability to survive on the ice with very little is impressive. There's no question about that. It's just that he wasn't a great CEO.
Yeah.
you know,
No, I
you
think
know.
that's the best way to look at it, because he is a fantastic vet. He's like, there's a job to do here, and it seems callous. Like, those folks will figure it out. They've got a good guy in charge. We're going to get back to the mission at hand because that is why I'm here. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, that is a way to do it. And then also, what else could he have done? I mean, like, it's
Well,
just
so
like,
there's a couple things you're right. He was really practical, and I make the case that because I talk in the early part of the book about his upbringing and how he was like a shapeshifter. Actually, he was really amazing. Like, he got thrown out of college in North Dakota for he was actually substitute teaching. When he was supposed to be in class, he was so smart. He was incredibly, he grew up in a
yeah,
one-room schoolhouse in North Dakota, and then he got chucked out of college. But he just applied to University of Iowa, ended up finishing his degree within a year, and then he got accepted to graduate school at Harvard. He was a genius, but he was able to. He wanted to go study in Africa, and he spent about a year planning. And then he found out about this other expedition, and immediately he's like, "Well, I'm going north." He didn't. He wasn't scared. Like, he was
mm,
intrepid. But also, I think that you said, what else could he have done? He was kind of manipulative, because when he got back to land, and this expedition was financed by the Canadian government, and they were spending a lot of money, right? And he had a sort of a blank checkbook, right? And so he also knew that where mail left from northern Canada and and Alaska, and he's like, well, I think I'll delay telling them what's going on, telling the Canadian government, and then send this information in this letter about the Karluk, what happened, because by that time it's winter, and there really is nothing you could do until the next season, when the waters become navigable again. But he waited pretty long, and he knew that by the time he ever heard back, he was already going to be off on his own ice adventure, and he was just going for it.
he's going for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The one of the things that's, and again, let's not get into the what happens, because there's it's there's some people who live, there's some people who die. We'll let you guys read the book, and really seriously read the book. It's fantastic. But
Thank
you
you.
got people that sign up for this expedition after surviving the Shackleton expedition. This blows my mind. They talk about intrepid people who are daring. Oh my gosh, here are these guys that are like, yeah, we'll go again. Why not? And then what are they thinking as the ice starts to creep in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because the cast of characters on the ship that I end up spending most of the book with, are really fascinating group, and they range from, you know, uh, the cook, uh, the firemen who keep the boilers in the steamship going, to regular seamen. Um, and then you've got these scientists who don't have, some of the scientists had never been on Arctic ice before, and then, as you mentioned, a couple of them, these Scots named Murray and Mackay, they were on the 1909 Nimrod expedition, not the most famous Shackleton one, but a prior one. And they learned kind of the Shackleton method of man hauling, sleds versus using dogs. And and it's really interesting because, so you've got this mix, and then you've got this Inuit family that Stefansson had hired, a man named Karluk, his wife Kiruk, and then these two kids, Helen and Mugpi, and then another young hunter named Kadektovik, who all figure into this story really prominently. But and then you've got Bartlett, and then this Norwegian guy named Bjarne Mammen, who's amazing, this amazing skier and athlete who, dreams of becoming like Nansen and like Amundsen. And you have his diary survives, and it's just a remarkable document. You get all of his internal thoughts and fears and dreams too, and he's really honest. He's got all this ambition, but it's tempered with the kind of real fears that any one of us would have if you're floating on fractured ice floe. And so you've got this odd group of people that are thrust together, and Captain Bartlett's trying to keep it all organized, and he knows that many of these, you mentioned the kind of mortality rate in this period. Prior to this, probably Arctic expeditions and Antarctic ones were like, I think 50% is a reasonable mortality rate. And so people kept going for different reasons. But Bartlett also knew, one of the compelling things to me is the mental component. He knew from prior expeditions and reading captain's logs what happens on board ships when you get to the long night. So after the sun goes down in December, it may be 2 to 3 months, depending on where you are, before the sun even returns. And so then you've got all these people who are in close quarters on an overcrowded ship, who can hear each other talking in the night, and you've got these different factions, some of whom are saying, including these Scots, they're saying, hey, we should probably go on our own. We should get off this ship and go for land like Stefansson did. And then Bartlett is in this really tough situation because he's technically the captain of the ship, but he has no orders regarding the scientific members, right? So it's not like in the Greeley expedition or something where it's a military outfit, and if somebody mutinies, that's treason, and you can execute them. Bartlett doesn't have that authority, and he's also he's a reasonable person. So there's a lot of they get into trouble, and certainly I've already mentioned it, and you can sort of tell from the cover that the ship does ultimately get crushed, and that's kind of when things get real, and when things really begin to kind of escalate. It's like, because now it's absolute survival on ice.
Right. It is shocking, like when you read the book and you realize just how fast ice moves and how powerful it is, and like how fast it sets in. I mean, there's times we have to act in an instant, and they're doing these incredible feats to get across a very short amount of water that's quickly going to become impassable. And then there's other times when their ice is so tight around them, they're like, how do I get beyond this obstacle? Or it's wild how powerful the ice is. And ice it's actually a big character in the book.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up and look at it that way, because I look at the ice exactly as a character. It is it's unpredictable. It is violent. It also has this incredible beauty to it. William McKinley, who's a Scottish mathematician who came along, and he records the ice in these beautiful passages. And also, I'm really glad you're illustrating that image, Pete, because a lot of people, they think of polar ice as this like giant ice rink, that's flat and
Right.
you can just cruise across it. And where these massive flows that are being propelled by wind and current, where they come together with other flows, they create these things called pressure ridges. And this is an example of one, and there's images in the book of even bigger ones. They encountered pressure ridges that were up to 100 feet high that they have to hack their way through with pickaxes, shovels, and cut like a switchback trail up through these gigantic pressure ridges if they're going to make it to this place called Wrangel Island, which is 100 miles above northern Siberia. It's a grim deal when your salvation is northern Siberia. It's like
Yeah.
that's where they send people to die.
Yeah, this is great. And so just for point of reference, the highest peak in Florida is 345 feet. So this ice is about half that high as the highest point in the whole state. Granted, it's Florida, but yeah. And then the remarkable, you guys got to read this book. It's so crazy. This guy Bartlett, he's equally as driven. And he's like, we're going to cut through this ice and make this switchbacky trail. And you're like, what on earth? I hope they make a movie out of this because I want to see this created on film. So you're just looking at, and then the calories these people burn as they're trying to survive.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that really I look at it after, there's the beginning of the trip until Stefansson leaves. Then there's, this period where they're floating, and it's actually really kind of foreboding because they have on the ship these captains, they have logs and pilot books and books written by other explorations and other expeditions that have occurred. And there's a consistency to this drift. So they know that Fridtjof Nansen has done this drift, but in a better equipped ship that wouldn't get crushed because it has a rounded hull. And then this other ship, the Jeanette, in 1879 got locked in the same ice and came near Wrangel Island where they're heading. And they know the terrible, terrible story of what happened to them. So they're reading by candlelight, these stories about exactly where they're heading. And it's really kind of like the worst thing you do is read horror stories that are really true about where you're heading. But at any rate, once the ship gets crushed, there's this other period where they live on what they call shipwreck camp. So Bartlett has been incredibly organized, and he has taken thousands of pounds of food and gear, and they built more sleds, and they have built kennels for the dogs on this stable flow of ice next to where the Karluk had been. And they, when he knows it's really all curtains for the Karluk, he has organized this incredible, offloading of gear and coal and everything and fuel. So they have to decide how he's going to. They see this island about 130 miles to the west, and Bartlett knows, like, when the light comes back in mid-February, we've got to try to make it to this island, and then that's just an ordeal, an incredible ordeal to get there. And Bartlett is also, he's racked with this responsibility because he knows. There's no radio. There was no radio on the Karluk, right? In 1913, there were some on other ships, but not on this one. And he knows that the only way that if they get to Wrangel Island, the only way these people are going to survive, because of the specter of another winter in this place, where on Wrangel Island it actually gets to minus 70 below zero, and he knows that he's going to have to do this Herculean mythic quest of about 1,000 miles to try to just tell the rest of the world where these survivors are, because no one but them know where they are.
Yeah,
it's really amazing.
It's very slow, but it's a constant time crunch, right? Like they have all this distance to cover, but all this self-provisioning they have to do, and there's ferrying of supply, like all this craziness. And then all this stuff just takes time, like the critical path to getting to potential rescue. One thing happens wrong and it slows you down or whatever it is. There's just all of these, they're just not just beset by ice, they're just beset by all these problems all around them.
Well, yeah, and it's amazing to me because when they do, when the light does return and they have Bartlett says, okay, we're going to go in teams, and he was really smart. I mean, Bartlett was really smart about how to move across the ice. So you mentioned ferrying, so they go in small teams, maybe 6 or 8 sled dogs, and then 4 members, and he starts sending them out, and they're building igloos along this route that is often obliterated by windstorms and everything else, and also the fact that the ice is shifting and cleaving and rupturing and moving. But they do manage to build this series of igloos. And what I was so amazed by is, having done some pretty hard things in my life, these guys are slogging maybe 15, 16 hours a day, double hauling their gear and getting to the end. And now you're soaked, frozen, and now you spend 45 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how good you are, building an igloo that you can then put some animal skins on the floor and slither into this igloo, maybe light a Primus stove, and then, drink some seal blubber and blood gruel and pemmican, and get up and do it again the next day. And sometimes the ice is rupturing underneath the igloo, and they're having to scamper out onto the ice. I mean, they always slept with their clothes on, and they slept with their feet in these little foot bags because they didn't want to be encased in a sleeping bag, or else they could just fall in the water and die. So yeah, you've got all these mini dramas going on at every turn. It's sort of incessant and terrifying.
Yeah, and terrifying. Yeah, and when you're talking about like wanting to get out of the bag right away, just for the sake of clarity, so you guys can all understand what we're talking about here, the ice at any point can break anywhere. And so you don't want to be fully in what we call in the Army a fart sack, because you're like, now I got to get up and run. And literally seconds between survival and death. So that's why you want to be warm and in this thing, but it's just, you're not afforded that luxury because of the crisis that they're in. We talked in the summer and you were getting ready to go to Wrangel Island. Did you make that trip?
This is one of the great bummers of my writing career. I had 2 trips planned. Well, the first one was, and this expedition out of this really great company called Heritage Expeditions out of New Zealand does a number of really amazing trips. And so the first one I was going to go on, and they were going to hook me up if I did a couple of lectures on the ship. And I was so excited because I'd looked at all these images, and Wrangel Island is a spectacular and amazing place, actually. And then the pandemic came around. Well, that was when I was doing the research and writing it. And then I finished the book and kind of was bummed out, but there you go. And then I was ready to go this summer, but there's a little hitch, which is that Putin invaded Ukraine, and Wrangel Island is considered, though this is kind of controversial at the moment, is considered Russian territory. And I will say a couple things about Wrangel Island because it's really cool. Anyone out there watching or listening could Google it. It's an amazing place. It has the largest denning population of polar bears in the world, and the largest breeding ground of Pacific walrus in the world. And those things are both really ironic because when the people make it over there in this story, and they land there, you'd think that there'd be this wealth of food, but the timing isn't exactly right. So the walrus aren't in there yet. And then the seals are offshore quite a way. So it's really hard physically to go get the seals. And the polar bears are out on the ice eating the seals. And so they have to do all this amazing hunting. But yeah, I wasn't able to go also because of that. And so, I did the best I could.
And just for point of reference, I'm looking on the map here. Wrangel Island is about the same latitude as like Prudhoe Bay, and this is not gentle country at all.
No. And, and just below Wrangel Island, in northern Siberia, I have a note in the book somewhere, and I discovered this fact that there's a couple little towns that are the coldest permanently inhabited places on Earth. So yeah, these guys, luckily for the people who make it to Wrangel Island, it doesn't have trees on it, but it has driftwood, right? So wood from other places, from many, hundreds of thousands of miles away, hundreds and thousands of miles, not hundreds of, wash up on the shores. And so the members who make it to Wrangel Island are able to build fires, which is, keeps them alive. And then they make a couple of these daring forays back to shipwreck camp to try to get more food, because they can only carry so much with them. That's one of the challenges, is there's only so much weight you can bring, on these sleds. And so then, yeah, the time on Wrangel Island, to me, is probably the most, and Bartlett's journey, I'll call it, Bartlett and Kadektovik's quest, are sort of the most dramatic. And when the members are on Wrangel Island, you get this strange kind of Lord of the Flies situation going on, where Bartlett had instructed them to sort of set up camp in a couple of different places so there'd be more room to hunt, and then periodically reconvene with one another and share food. But it ends up that by the time they get to Wrangel Island, many of the members are in pretty dire condition. And I'm talking about, frostbite, hypothermia. There's this mystery malaise that they get, and swelling sickness where their limbs are bloated and they have nausea. And, they don't know whether it's the pemmican that they're eating, which, is the Arctic staple of like dried meat and suet and berries. And they're trying to survive by hunting, subsistence hunting, and that's where the family, the Inupiat family, really comes in. And I make the case, and I stand by it, that everyone would have died had it not been for the skills of the Inupiat people that Stefansson hired at the last minute.
Yeah, maybe one of the best moves he made, because I don't want to say that they're not bothered by this, but they're definitely better equipped. Every time there's something that needs doing, these people are just working and saving people, and they know when there's a risk that's not worth doing, and then they're like, no, this risk we're going to take.
Right. And then their knowledge of the ice, as an example, like they'll say, well, we have to wait. We can't move until that ice has knitted up and it's colder. But also, yeah, the industriousness on Wrangel Island is just amazing to me. Auntie, the wife of Karluk, is, she has a number of vital jobs. I mean, she sews all this Arctic clothing that is really crucial, of skins, boots, mucklucks, trousers, parkas with hoods and mittens. She is incredibly efficient skinning seals and cooking every part of these seals that they get. And also the kids, they devise some really innovative hunting techniques. Like the little girl Helen, put seal blubber on the end of a feather quill as kind of a hook, and she puts that on a sinew string and chucks it out there where seagulls are, and the seagulls will eat that and it gets stuck in their gullet, and then she drags it in, and now you got seagull soup, And then they also, Auntie, who is Karluk is her name, the woman seamstress, like figures out how to use her Arctic clothing sewing needles as hooks, and she finds these 12-inch or so tom cod, these polar cod, in these creeks, and she ends up, jigging for them and snagging them and getting hundreds of them, keeping them alive. It's incredible.
It is incredible. It is incredible. So you grab a hold of all of these diaries. So do you know the basic story? I mean, you probably know the basics of it, but like, do you know who lives, who dies? And then when you start digging into these different log books, how in the world do you sort out how you're going to tell this story and how you structure it? I think you did a great job, but how do you get there from where you start?
And wow, Pete, that's such a great question, because that's I think I'm getting better and better at it with every book. But I have this wealth of material in these diaries. And so what I love about the last few books that I've written, and it was the same to a degree with my book Conquistador about Cortez and Montezuma, but you only kind of get one side of that story. Cortez Spanish side. But here, what's so cool is that you've got these diaries, right? And they record their innermost thoughts and also because it was a scientific expedition, they did have some equipment. And so what's really great is that you're able to get like what temperature it was on a particular day and how much the wind was blowing and where they were. And they're really I mean, these guys were writing in their journals inside of igloos after 15-hour trek. And it's in William McKinley, the Scotsman, and Bjarne Mammen, and then a number of other ones, including Bartlett. So the tricky, what I try to do is find the quotes that really bring character to the fore, like, not only what happened and the kind of chronology, which is crucial, but to me where it gets interesting is using the actual things that people wrote and having that express who they are and how they make decisions and the kind of character they have. And and that's why, I mean, if you at the front of the book, I have these two sort of dueling quotes, because this book is a bit about two men, essentially, Bartlett and Stefansson. And the quotes are, Bartlett says, "Call it love of adventure if you will, for as long as there is a square mile of this old earth's surface that is unexplored, man will want to seek out that spot and find out all about it and bring back word of what he finds." And right below that, I have Stefansson, who says, "An adventure is a sign of incompetence." And it's funny. That is very ironic, because ultimately this thing becomes a grand adventure that may, in certain respects, been a result of his incompetence. But yeah, that is the fun part, and the challenging part is pouring through thousands of pages of documents, and some of it is handwritten, which is really gets hard. Luckily, thank goodness, this guy William McKinley had stellar handwriting, and he wrote a couple of 300 pages in small single space. And so you're looking for these nuggets where they say something that is very revealing. And what's cool too, I just have to add, is that in a way you've got this weird thing that's kind of like a Survivor episode, because you have those on the fly voiceovers where they're talking to just that one person and he's saying things about the other people on Survivor. And in this book, they're very honest about each other. And so you'll have this Norwegian guy, Mammen, writing, I think these two Scotsmen are planning a mutiny, actually. And I'm not, they've asked me 3 times if I'll go with them. And the last time I told them, if they ask me again, that's going to be the end of it. We're going to have words. And so you've got these and Bartlett Mammen is this strapping, buff Norwegian guy who's like, listen, don't bug me. I'm with Bartlett. He's my guy. And then, so there's just a lot of brutal honesty about the other members. And sometimes, there's sniping and jealousies. But the other thing I'm amazed by is how Bartlett manages to, how people ultimately do come together. In addition to this book being terrifying and about hardship and survival on the frozen seas and frostbite, possible murder, starvation, and a dramatic rescue attempt, there's also, selflessness and sacrifice and courage and real human tenderness at times, which, these people are in dire straits, and you see the true nature of people come out.
Yeah, no, I love it. Here's the cover of the book for everybody, by the way.
Oh,
I'll take the link out for a second.
I
And,
love that.
you see the Karluk there. And it's funny, this story, man, it is so great. I'm so glad that you told this story, because it shows it shows how impossibly tough and resilient man, and I mean mankind, can be, when they choose to take on a challenge, and then they're thrown all these adversities, and there's the will to live and what they do for one another. Um, you're reading these things, it's got to be powerfully emotional. I mean, if I'm writing in my diary and I'm doing, and on this adventure, I'm like, I may not make it. So there's some housekeeping I have to do on who I am, where I've been, my family, in case they read this thing. It must have been heartbreaking to read that stuff.
Oh man, yeah, there are times where I got very emotional, because you get to know these characters, like you're living with them for
Yes.
over a year when you're drafting and researching. And this, especially this guy, I keep coming back to this guy, Bjorn Maamen, who he he really had these dreams of becoming a grand, famous explorer, but
Right.
he ends up getting injured quite early on, like dislocates his knee, and so you've got this super strong guy who Bartlett is counting on, and he feels like he's letting his captain down, and he's really honest in his diaries, and he writes about his his insecurities and how he's thinking about home a lot, and he keeps coming back to this one thing. He says at one point, like, he finds like little wildflowers growing up in the snow, and he's really in bad shape, and he says, like, as long as there is life, there is hope. And a number of the members, including William McKinley, the Scottish schoolteacher, they kind of cling to this notion that as long as there is life, there's hope, and not to give up.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's a real great, like, it's almost like they built the hero's journey off of this story, right? Because yeah, then, Bartlett has to go not on his own, but he has to leave the group to go do his own impossible journey with Karluk. And you're just like, when are these guys ever going to get a break? And just because you get to society and civilization, that does not end your problems. Like, you've got all these other problems. I'm like, oh my God, it just never ends.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think this thing it would have to be a multiple part series, because
For sure.
Bartlett's journey in his own is just this. It's it's really quite unbelievable that they
Yeah.
pull it off,
Yeah.
and thank goodness that this guy Kadek is with him, because they have to move across 100 miles of ice that's shifting and breaking, and with a small number of dogs, and they're also encountering polar bears. It's funny, people are like asking me, well, why don't they just hunt polar bears? And I'm like, well, the problem was the polar bears were hunting them most of the
Yeah.
time, because they're like coming around. The dogs would wake these guys up in the middle of the night, and they look out of the igloo, and there's a couple of giant polar bears sitting there harassing the dogs, trying to kill the dogs. And so
Yeah.
then it's more about like protecting themselves. Plus they're killing seals, and they're dragging seals along in their sleds, and the polar bears, that's their main food source. So they're just got this scent trail for miles. They're just being stalked by polar bears.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you're right. Bartlett has to make that really hard decision, to leave the rest of the surviving members behind and go to get help. And that quest is one of my. I mean, it's probably it was my favorite part in ways to write, because
Yeah.
it's really hard, and you do encounter some fascinating people along the way who help them. And the whole goal is, can they make it back to Alaska, where Bartlett can then get news to the world about where the survivors are.
Yeah. And time is of the essence. There's no time to dawdle. And then you have the maddening thing. And I don't want to spoil the book, but in the time that it was, just because you get to civilization doesn't mean someone's like, sure, let's use my boat and let's go get people. Like, it's far from that, and just the anxiety he must have felt of being safe, right? And
Right.
and unable to move as quickly as he needed, because it is just impossible to do so.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right, and there's so many different impediments too, because there's no way to communicate. I mean, there's one telegraph station like at the bottom of this place called Anadir, Emma Harbor, but that's like hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And Bartlett knows the only surefire way is to get back across the Bering Strait if he can. But you're right, time is of the essence, because there are only certain periods when, especially in 1913, when there was open water
Yeah.
to get across, right? And so you have to nail that timing. And so, yeah, there's all this anxiety that Bartlett feels, and responsibility, and also the unknowing about, like, have these people managed to survive on the limited resources they have.
And you do a hell of a job creating that, in your writing. I mean, if no one's told you, just that
Oh,
part of the
thanks, man.
book, because you're just like, oh, like, is it going to happen now? Is it going to happen? Like, when are they going to be? Oh, and it's just, we lose track of how challenging the world was. This is 100 years ago. This is
Absolutely.
not like, there's not probably anybody alive, maybe a couple people in the entire world, but you know, this is around the time the Titanic sunk. We know a lot about that, but there's no plastic. There's so many things that don't
It's
exist.
right.
You
I
know?
mean, yeah, it's amazing. I was thinking about this earlier today, actually, like what was happening. As you mentioned, that the Titanic has gone down just in the year before, 1912. And so that's on everybody's mind, actually, because if that ship uh, can go down, then a 129-foot wooden hulled brigantine,
Yeah.
with a motor that Bartlett and his first mate said has the power of an old coffee pot is not going to fare
Right.
that well. And then, like, I mean, listen, the Model T is only just about come out in, I think, 1908, and Orville and Wilbur Wright have taken flight 10 years earlier. I mean, but it's a time of inquiry and study, and that's why this was a scientific journey. Like the North Pole had been bagged supposedly by Robert Peary just in 1909, and Bartlett, incidentally, was on that expedition with him. He made it to within 150 miles of the North Pole. But yeah, you're right. Like it's a it's not that long ago, but in terms of technology and communication, people were just more cut off than we think about now. You could sort of just pull out your phone and figure out where you are in the world.
Yeah, and so there's one more thing I wanted to get into real quick, and I'm on memory here. I didn't have a chance to review that part of the book, but part of the rescuing is a ship built by a guy named Matthew Turner, if memory serves. That guy's shipyard is in my hometown, Benicia.
No way. Yeah, I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
yeah, yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, because at least so far as the there's some really amazing ironies that occur, and one of them is just I couldn't even believe it, because um, uh, so at a certain point there's going to be a rescue attempt made, and there are some really cool ships that are brought to bear on this, including one called the Bear, which it turned out was a ship that figures prominently in my book Labyrinth of Ice, because the
Hmm.
Bear is used to go and try and find the Greely survivors up on Ellesmere Island, right, between Greenland and Canada. And so then you've got this other really cool ship, the King and Wing, that's a walrus hunting ship, and a couple other ones. One's called the Corwin. And so you've got this like, will they make it? Meanwhile, World War One breaks out, like, right as the rescue mission is trying to be put together, and so you've got these icebreakers from Russia which have to turn around because now they're going to be start to be used, and it's just yeah. I try to make that section run sort of really fast, like the chapters get shorter,
Hmm.
and you're cutting back and forth between what's happening to the members of the island, Wrangel Island, and then other places. And is there a rescue? Is it going to happen? It was really fun to write that part.
So I just looked it up, and the ship that is in the story that was built in my hometown is actually the Karluk itself.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And
yeah.
it's
I
funny
mean,
because the shipyard still sort of exists. It's a ruin, but these things aren't that old in terms of the history of a
yeah.
city, especially
What's your
you know,
hometown?
Benicia,
Oh,
California. And so the
oh yeah,
Matthew
yeah.
Turner shipyard, there's schools named after him, all that stuff. So yeah,
Wow,
that's what it was.
that's
It's the
cool.
car. How great is that? That's such a neat thing.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
the ships in these days were just, they did amazing things. But I have to say, one of the mysteries to me is why more people didn't. So I mentioned that Fridtjof Nansen gentleman, and way back in 1890s, he built a ship that is now it's a museum in Norway called the Fram. The ship itself
Yeah.
is a museum, and he figured out that if you had a rounded hull, as the ice invariably began to, like, encroach around you, it would just
Yeah.
float that ship up, and then you're like in a hotel. And 30, 40 years later, they're still taking the wrong equipment, for the
Right.
job. And it's kind of
Yeah.
like, part of it had to do with financing. It was very expensive and you need a bunch of them. But also, I just think they were slow to learn from nonsense techniques.
Man, I just thank you again. What a great book. I really enjoyed it. Everything I've written or read by you it's just been fantastic. And it's such a treat to get to know you and share this time with you. So thank you for that. And then tell us what's next. What are you working on next? Because I'm positive it's going to be incredible.
Thanks a lot, Pete. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's been really fun talking about this book. But I am, in fact, under contract with my publisher to do a new book called Realm of Ice and Sky, and it is
Mm,
about the first dirigibles, airships that attempted to fly to the North Pole, and some ultimately in the 20s did, in fact, fly to the North Pole. And the catastrophic consequences of some, which, of course, uh, crashed and burned. And so it's going to round out a trilogy. So I'll have two stories, Labyrinth of Ice and Empire of Ice and Stone, that are you're on the ice a lot. And then I decided let's get above the ice, and
yeah.
there's some amazing cast of characters in this, because it ultimately becomes one of the largest probably the largest rescue attempt in polar history, because there's a bunch of guys that end up on the ground and in
Yeah.
bad shape.
Ah, geez, that's so neat.
So we'll talk about
When
that
you
one in a couple of years.
was there one archive for all of the journals? Is it all like at the Huntington Library in Southern California or something like that? Or
You mean for Empire of Ice and Stone, or? Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's kind of all over the place. So I am deeply indebted to librarians and institutions all over the world,
Mm,
including the National Library of Scotland, which has all this McKinley stuff, and libraries in British Columbia, Dartmouth, Bowdoin College, all over Canada. It's been, and the librarians, since I wrote this thing during the pandemic, it was incredibly helpful, because sometimes they were going in, on staffs were home, but like they would go in and help me out to find particular
right.
things. It was really, yeah, librarians rule the world, and they should. They rule my
Yeah.
world.
Yeah, well, it's
you know.
neat, and it's such a cool endeavor to get a chance to do that. And if not you, who else is going to tell these stories, right? Like it's just you're able to put them together, and then they're marketable and fantastic and sell well, so you get to keep doing it. So I'm super stoked for you, man. It's
I
what a great
appreciate it.
life.
There are some very good writers in this space, I will say, who I look up to a great deal. But yeah, this I'm really looking forward to the next one, because I get to travel to Svalbard, Norway, in the
Oh,
summer, and go to the places where they tethered these giant airships and attempted to send it. This is like 1905. This American guy named Walter Wellman. He was
wow.
wild, crazy man. But yeah, I do love the travel part of it. I try to go to the places that I'm going to write about, or at least as close as I can get.
I love it. Hey, I've got 100 more questions, and I could do this all day. But do you have anything in closing so I can let you go?
Oh, I mean, I would just say thanks for uh, reading my books, for one thing. It's really great to hear, from people out there who are enjoying these stories and getting a lot out of them, and learning a bit about
Mm,
history, but in a way that might be, not dry.
yeah, not try for sure. Well, listen, I'm going to run the credits. Stand by 1 sec. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much